Try not to trip, sweetie. Those were the words the captain whispered to me on my own ship, right in front of my entire crew. He saw a woman in a civilian coat with a limp, and he decided I was a broken liability. He laughed. He humiliated me. He thought he was untouchable. But he made one fatal mistake. He hadn't bothered to look at who I actually was. He didn't know that inside the leather folder on the wardroom table were my orders to command his ship. And he definitely didn't know that my Master Chief, the man who had pulled me from the Jaws Dev death a decade ago, was standing right behind him, ready to end his career with just 6 words. This is a story about what happens when arrogance meets the immovable truth. Today, you'll learn that your worth is never defined by the people who try to keep you in your place. If you believe in standing tall when the world tells you to sit down, hit that like button, comment "I am still standing," and subscribe to join our community of strength. Let's dive into the truth. The rain had ceased hours ago, yet the pier remained choked with a lingering dampness. The wooden boards slick and exhaling a thin gray mist where the early sunlight dared to touch them. I approached the brow with the measured, deliberate pace I had practiced for 8 years, planting each foot firmly, waiting for the deck to register my presence before entrusting my full weight to it. A cutter rigged for a change of command ceremony is a vision of pristine order, a beautiful display of white paint, polished bright work, and bunting snapping sharply in the biting cold air. The hull of the Drummond loomed over me like an ivory wall as I ascended, my eyes perpetually cast downward to read the deck. A necessary habit when one half of your leg is constructed of carbon fiber and a mechanical socket. My focus was so narrowed to the safety of the path that I failed to notice the man at the summit of the brow, specifically the way his face rearranged itself into a settled, dismissive judgment before I could even draw breath to speak. "Try not to trip, sweetie," he remarked, his voice carrying with that practiced, effortless projection of a man who assumes he owns the atmosphere. His tone was not merely an observation. It was a weaponized condescension. Decks are tricky for the unsteady. A ripple of laughter moved through the small group of officers standing near him, though it was not universal. A young lieutenant with a fresh, sharp haircut and a clipboard laughed the loudest, his eyes darting toward the senior man, desperate to prove that he understood the punchline of a joke that wasn't funny. I reached the summit, ignoring the heat of humiliation that threatened to rise in my throat. I turned aft and saluted the ensign, a reflexive action honed by 23 years of service, and then performed the same crisp salute to the officer of the deck. The man who had mocked me was a captain, 4 gold stripes rigid on his sleeve, his chest adorned with a chest of ribbons, his jaw set with the unearned confidence of a man who had been told his entire life that he was exactly where he belonged. He watched my salute and clearly dismissed it as a pathetic attempt at civilian play acting, his mouth curving into a mask of patient, pitying amusement. I had crossed 100 brows in my career, and I had learned the hard way that the people most certain of who belongs in a space are usually the ones who have never once had to prove they did. I did not tell him who I was. I have never possessed the inclination to justify my existence to those who have already decided I am invisible. My voice was level, quiet, and devoid of the tremor of anger as I asked where I might locate the Command Master Chief. The captain gestured dismissively, the same way one might shoo a bird off a railing. "The Command Master Chief is busy. We have a ceremony in 2 hours. If you are with the caterer, the reception tent is back on the pier. Mind the brow on the way down." I said, "Thank you," and I meant it not as a sign of submission, but in that strange hollow way you can mean a word even as it cuts you open. I stood on the deck of the vessel I had flown 3,000 miles to command, dressed in a borrowed charcoal overcoat because my official uniforms were trapped in a shipping container somewhere in transit. I did not give him the face he was waiting for, the flustered, embarrassed, or angry face of a woman who felt out of place. I have spent 10 years building a face that does not offer others what they expect, and it is most the valuable thing I own. A seaman standing near the brow had not joined in the laughter. He was barely 19, yet he had gone perfectly still, his eyes clouded with that raw, unvarnished empathy young people possess before they learn the social utility of cruelty. He looked at me with an expression that bordered on apology, as if he felt the need to articulate that the captain was a singular failure of character that did not reflect the soul of the ship. I gave him a small, imperceptible nod, a signal for a sailor to carry on, and watched him flush, look away, and file the moment into his memory. These are the ones worth keeping. The wind off the water smelled of salt, cold and clean, and I felt the familiar, grounding ache of being exactly where I had spent a decade fighting to be, despite being treated as a trespasser on my own property. The water has no opinion on the legitimacy of a human leg. It does not care for titles or the arrogance of men in dress uniforms. It only respects the truth of what you do when the sea finally has you in its grip. And on this morning, I was simply waiting for the world to catch up to the reality I had already conquered. The morning routine of a cutter is a symphony of machinery and human effort that I could read like my own handwriting, long before I reached the brow. My day began in the darkness of a hotel room, sitting on the edge of the rack, engaging in the quiet, ritualistic business of becoming whole again. You roll the liner on, checking the skin, the part of you that ultimately betrays you before seating the socket and standing up slowly, inviting the leg to accept the burden of your weight. It is an act of defiance. A daily calculation of whether the prosthetic will act as a part of your own anatomy or as a difficult guest you are forced to entertain for 14 hours. On this morning, the decision was made. I would be the woman who does not explain herself. The brow was merely the first obstacle, the opening test in a long series of hurdles I had overcome in silence. I stood by the rail, watching the gray water move against the hull, feeling the familiar, bitter flavor of being in a place I knew better than anyone present. Yet, standing in the shadow of a man who believed I lacked the capacity to walk on it, the Command Master Chief, Vance, eventually emerged from below deck, moving across the space with the natural authority of a man who owns a ship without ever needing to crowd it. He was a man of nearly 50, his temples graying, his chest covered in the hard-earned evidence of a 30-year career. He approached to perform the routine courtesies of a ceremony day, his professional face carefully composed, warm and welcoming. Then he looked at me. It was not a casual glance. It was the sharp, diagnostic stare of a man who has suddenly walked into a ghost of his own past. His eyes traced my face, searching for markers buried in his memory, before dropping for a fraction of a second to the set of my stance. The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving him pale on his own quarterdeck. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with an uncharacteristic sharpness, "it's you." I knew him instantly, the last time I had seen his face. It had been upside down, illuminated by the strobing, chaotic lights of a storm-tossed sea, his hands pulling me from the dark. He was the coxswain who had hauled me over the gunwale of the small boat, the man who had kept me from drowning in the wake of the Marielle. 10 years of time folded between us like a discarded chart. The memory of diesel, the freezing spray, and the screaming of the wind hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had been the last face I saw before the ocean took me, and I had been a question he had carried, unanswered and bleeding, for an entire decade. Now that question had walked up his gangway in a charcoal coat and been instructed to mind the stairs by a man who didn't know his own ship. Owen turned. He did not look at me. He turned his gaze to Captain Thorne, and his voice erupted from his chest, cutting across the festive morning like a parting line under extreme load. "Captain," he said, his tone lethal in its flatness, "you just ended your career." The side party went deathly still, not just quiet, but a total cessation of movement. 200 people sensed the seismic shift in reality, a first-class petty officer nearby, a young man with eyes that looked far older than his age, stepped forward without waiting for permission. "That's the officer from the Marielle," he whispered to the world. "That's her." I watched the meaning evaporate from Thorne's face while the smile remained frozen, like light dying in a room after the power is cut. He was no longer a leader. He was a man standing on a deck with an expression he had no further use for. I felt no triumph. I only felt a heavy, familiar dread. I had been here before, standing in the center of the turning world, and I knew that vindication is a cold country, one that does not lead to healing. I raised a hand, a subtle gesture that told Owen to hold. The deck, poised to tip into chaos, obeyed my silent command. I knew the rules of this game. We would do this with the colors flying. Not like this. We are better than this. And these sailors needed to see what excellence looks like, not a public hanging, but a restoration of order. The person that followed was not a parade of triumph, but a lesson in quiet, searing accountability. As I stood on the bridge wing, the cold wind whipping against my face, I watched the machinery of the Coast Guard recalibrate itself in real time. Vice Admiral Helena Marsh, an officer whose reputation for steely pragmatism preceded her by 1,000 miles, had arrived on the pier, and the atmosphere shifted from festive anticipation to something far more somber and electric. She had witnessed the aftermath of Thorne's arrogance firsthand, and in the quiet efficiency of her movements, I saw the inevitable conclusion of a career built on fragile, performative excellence. She said nothing to me as she passed. She simply looked at the space where the outgoing captain had been standing, and, with a curt nod to her aide, set in motion the quiet, administrative dismantling of his reputation. It was not the dramatic, explosive downfall I had once imagined in my darkest hours, but rather the slow, grinding sound of institutional machinery correcting a mistake. My shipping container had finally been delivered, and as I walked back up the brow this time in service dress blues, the dark fabric crisp and familiar, the 4 gold stripes gleaming under the cold, pale sun, I felt the weight of the Coast Guard medal pinned to my chest. I had kept it in a drawer for a decade, a talisman of a night I believed I had to hide from. But as the metallic pins pierced the wool of my jacket, I understood that I had been treating my heroism like a debt and my injury like a prison sentence. Both were lies I had whispered to myself in the dark, to avoid the crushing reality that I was the one who had survived. The pipe sounded, a long, mournful and beautiful call that echoed over the water, signaling the arrival of the commanding officer, and for the first time in 10 years. I did not feel like a ghost haunting my own life. I felt the vibration of the ship beneath my feet, the rhythmic hum of the generators, and the subtle living conversation of a vessel at rest. When the side boys rendered honors, I did not cry. I was far beyond the reach of simple cathartic tears. I was anchored in the absolute, terrifying clarity of the present. As I stepped onto the quarterdeck, I made eye contact with Owen Vance. He was holding his salute, his arm perfectly steady, his eyes locked onto mine with a fierce, unwavering respect that told me more than 1,000 apologies ever could. I relieved the executive officer, who was pale and visibly shaken by the preceding chaos, and in the dry, rhythmic language of naval procedure, the Drummond became mine. 4,000 tons of steel, a crew of over 100 souls, and a future that I had been told, by a dozen well-meaning doctors and risk-averse detailers, was entirely beyond my reach. I stood at the lectern to deliver my remarks, looking out at the rows of faces, some curious, some fearful, some still processing the fall of their previous leader, and I spoke with the cadence of someone who had learned to walk through fire. I did not mention the leg. I did not mention the bar. I spoke only of the ship, of the standard we would hold, and of the fundamental, uncompromising courtesy we would owe one another. The courtesy of finding out who a person truly is before we decide they don't belong in our presence. The silence that greeted my closing statement was not the awkward hush of a room full of people waiting for a cue. It was the heavy, contemplative silence of a crew, realizing their compass had been reset. The reckoning that followed was not merely administrative. It was deeply personal, and it required a different kind of courage, the courage to go where the grief was still raw. Weeks after taking command, I drove 4 hours up the coast to a modest, weathered house on the edge of the world, where a rusting boat trailer sat as a monument to a life interrupted. I had written to Rosa Sandoval years prior, a sterile official letter that carried all the bureaucratic weight of a casualty report but none of the humanity. Standing on her porch, I felt like a coward, terrified that my mere existence, walking on a mix of flesh and titanium, would be an insult to the mother whose son had been claimed by the same water that spared me. When she opened the door, her face was lined with the geography of long-term sorrow, but her eyes held a sharp, penetrating intelligence. She invited me into the kitchen, the room smelling of dark roast coffee and salt. And she did not look away when her gaze dropped to my leg. She looked at it, then back at my face. And she commanded me to tell her the real story, not the one in the file, but the one that had haunted me for 3,000 days. I sat at her table and poured out everything. The gale, the darkness, the impossible precision of the 2-second window, and the feeling of Mateo's hand finally, firmly closing over mine. I told her that I had paid for that connection with the very structure of my body, and that I would have paid it 100 times over if it meant he could have walked away from the bar alive. Rosa listened with an intensity that made the room feel as though it were shrinking, until the only things that existed were her presence and my confession. When I reached the part about the seventh soul, about the boy I could not hold, I stopped, unable to push the words past the blockade in my throat. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, her grip shockingly strong for a woman who seemed so fragile. She told me that I had been punishing myself for the simple, biological fact of survival, and that her son, a young man who had prioritized the safety of older men above his own, would have despised such a hollow waste of life. "You have been carrying him in your grief, and it has made you smaller," she said, her voice fierce with a mother's ironclad certainty. "He was mine first. You gave a leg trying to save him. That is a price no one should have to pay. But you have paid it enough. You are allowed to set the guilt down. Let me carry the memory now. So you can go back to being the person who saves lives, instead of the person who mourns them." In that kitchen, in the shadow of the sea that had defined both of our lives, I finally allowed the dam to break. I wept for the boy I couldn't save, for the years I had spent hiding in shore jobs, and for the woman I had forced myself to become to survive the loneliness of being protected by a system that didn't believe in me. Before I left, she took me to the yard and showed me a photograph of Mateo, his face illuminated by a sun that no longer had any opinion of him. A grin that spoke of a life lived entirely without the burden of fear. She asked if I was going back to sea, and when I confirmed it, she nodded with deep, satisfied grace. She told me to take him with me not as a ghost of failure, but as a passenger of purpose. I returned to the Drummond with a heart that felt, the first time, not light, but balanced, when we stood out past the breakwater, the cutter slicing through the heavy, gray swells of the Pacific. I stood on the bridge wing and felt the prosthetic bite into the deck, the cold reality of the metal meeting the steel. I had the con, the woman they had told to be careful on the stairs. The woman they had shooed toward the catering tent was navigating a force of nature that had already taken so much from her. I looked at the young officer of the deck beside me, the one who had once laughed because he thought it was safe, and I saw him observing me, watching how I read the sea, how I read the ship, and how I stood firmly in the center of the storm. He was learning in real time that true authority is not found in the volume of your voice or the stripes on your sleeve, but in the unwavering ability to hold your ground when the world tells you to trip. I had finally stopped trying to prove I belonged. I simply wasn't in that existence. I found the only truth that mattered. The transition from a ghost of the past to the commanding officer of a national security-led cutter is not an overnight revelation. It is a grueling, repetitive process of reclamation that happens in the quiet moments between the alarms. After my return from the coast, the Drummond became more than just a vessel of 4,000 tons. It became a laboratory of leadership, where the culture of condescension that had once flourished under Thorne was methodically replaced by a standard of brutal, objective excellence. I spent my days in the wardroom and my nights on the bridge, forcing myself to be visible, to be undeniably competent, and to be profoundly human. The young officer of the deck, Sawyer's Ridgway, who had once found humor in my perceived unsteadiness, had transformed into one of the most reliable lieutenants under my command. He watched me with a vigilance that bordered on the obsessive, not out of fear, but out of a genuine desire to calibrate his own moral compass to mine. One evening, as we patrolled the gray, churning expanse off the coast, he approached me during a quiet watch. He spoke with the tentative air of a man stepping onto thin ice, finally asking the question that had hung in the air of this ship since my arrival: how I had lost the leg. The entire crew had heard the whispers of the Marielle, treating the subject like unexploded ordnance, walking wide of it to avoid the radius of my personal history. So I was the first to ask plainly, without the filtered cushioning of professional etiquette. I told him the short version, stripping away the heroics and focusing on the mechanical, cold reality of the event. He listened, his face set in a mask of intense concentration, and when I finished, there were no platitudes, no hollow remarks about courage. He simply said, "I laughed at you because the captain told me it was safe to. I'm never going to do that again as long as I live." In that moment, I realized that my purpose on this ship was not merely to navigate the water, but to navigate the culture of the institution itself. I had spent a decade feeling the ache of being protected by men who had written me off as a broken frame, a ship fit only for the pier. By standing on that bridge, by refusing to flinch when the cutter slammed into the troughs of the bar, I was dismantling that narrative piece by piece. Resilience, I discovered, is not the ability to bounce back. It is the ability to change your shape to fit the reality of your new circumstances. I had spent 10 years mourning the person I was before the bar, the woman who had 2 legs and a naive, unshakable faith in the fairness of the service. I had to learn that the woman who replaced her was not a diminished version, but a honed one. I was no longer interested in being the golden girl who checked every box on a resume. I was interested in being the officer who could hold a crew together when the weather turned and the world went dark, every morning as I strapped on the prosthesis. The ritual no longer felt like a negotiation with a difficult guest. It felt like an act of arming myself for a war against the expectations of others. I began to see the way the younger sailors, the ones who had only ever known a version of the Coast Guard that was becoming increasingly inclusive, looked at me. To them, I was not a woman with a medical board history. I was a commanding officer who knew the weight of the sea and the cost of the watch. I was becoming this example I had so desperately needed a decade ago. The proof that your worth is not something you are granted by the institution, but something you claim for yourself. The final test of my command did not come in the form of a formal inspection or a visit from the admiral, but in the return to the very water that had demanded my pound of flesh. We were tasked with a heavy weather exercise off the coast, moving back into the treacherous currents where the river meets the sea over the bar that had claimed so many. As the Drummond stood out past the breakwater, the sky a bruising purple against the steel-gray horizon, the ship began to lift and slam with a violence that made the deck plates hum beneath my boots. I stood on the bridge wing, my hands gripping the railing, the prosthetic planted firm on the vibrating steel. Every time the bow dropped into a trough and the entire ship shuddered under the impact of the swell, I felt the phantom sensation of the loss in my residual limb, but I did not stumble. I had learned to read the rhythm of the waves, to anticipate the drop and the lift, and to move in concert with the vessel rather than against it. I had the con. The woman they had told to mind Hastairs was standing at the center of the storm, navigating the most dangerous stretch of water on the coast with a calm that unnerved the officers on the bridge. Owen Vance stood a few paces behind me, his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced, predatory focus of a veteran coxswain. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was a constant reminder of the night we had shared, a bridge between the woman I was and the captain I had become. "We've held your deck, ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible over the roaring of the wind. Yet it carried the weight of a solemn promise. I looked out at the breaking water, the white-capped walls that had once represented the end of my life, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. The bar was no longer a tomb, it was a classroom. I realized then that the silence I had cultivated, the good face I had built over 10 years, was not a wall to keep people out, but a foundation to hold myself up. I turned to Sawyer, who was standing at the OOD station, his eyes clear and focused, his movements precise and professional. "Lieutenant," I said, my voice steady, "keep the course. We are exactly where we need to be." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of fire and charcoal, I thought of the young woman I had been a decade ago, sitting in that hospital bed, terrified that her identity had been washed away by the tide. I wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that she hadn't been washed away, she had been forged. I wanted to tell her that the leg was just a piece of engineering, but the courage to stand up in the dark was a piece of the soul. The Drummond pushed forward, a solitary blade of steel against the infinite, indifferent reach of the Pacific. I looked down at my hands, resting on the rail, and saw that they were steady. I was not the same woman, and I was not the same officer, but I was at long last home. The sea had no opinion of me, and it had no opinion of the bar, and it certainly had no opinion of the captain. But as the lights of the distant shore began to flicker like dying stars, I knew that the only person whose opinion mattered was the one looking back at me from the surface of the glass. I had taken the watch, I had paid the price, and as the cutter surged forward into the deep, dark water, I knew that I would stay there as long as the sea required it, standing firm, balanced, and entirely, irrevocably free. Command is often described in the manuals as a series of decisions, but in the reality of a cutter at sea, command is a series of silent agreements. My relationship with the crew of the Drummond had evolved from a dynamic of observation to one of mutual, hard-won trust. I was no longer the woman in the borrowed coat, nor was I the subject of curiosity regarding my prosthetic. I was the captain, a role that demanded I embody the standard I expected from others. This became acutely clear during a routine search and rescue training exercise that pushed the boundaries of our operational capability. The crew was tasked with recovering a dummy from the churning, freezing waters of the channel, a simulation that mimicked the conditions of my own past. I stood on the bridge, watching the bridge team cycle through the protocols, and I noticed a hesitation in the boat crew, a momentary flicker of doubt when the swells hit the sand side of the small boat. It was the same rhythm, the same heartbeat of the sea that had defined the night on the Marielle. I did not intervene, but I walked out onto the bridge wing, letting them see me standing there, planted firmly, unmoving. My presence was not a critique, it was a baseline. I was the personification of the idea that this water, as dangerous as it was, could be mastered through training, grit, and the refusal to succumb to panic. When the boat crew successfully recovered the target and navigated the return to the ship with surgical precision, I saw the shift in their body language. They hadn't just completed an exercise. They had validated their own capacity to function in the chaos. That evening, I sat in my cabin, reviewing the logs and looking at the photographs of my previous billets, the shore jobs, the staff roles, the manageable assignments I had been handed by detailers who thought they were protecting me from my own limitations. I realized that for 10 years, I had been living in a state of self-imposed exile, convinced that by staying small, I was honoring the memory of the dead. I looked at my leg, the prosthetic resting against the bulkhead, and for the first time, it didn't look like a failure or a scar. It looked like a tool. I had spent so much of my life viewing the event as a subtraction, a leg lost, a life extinguished, that I had failed to see what had been added to the equation. I had gained the capacity to lead from a place of genuine, scarred experience. I wasn't just a leader who understood the theory of command. I was an officer who understood the anatomy of sacrifice. I realized that my refusal to be seen had been a disservice to every young officer who felt they didn't fit the mold by choosing to stand on the bridge, by choosing to remain on active duty, and by choosing to lead the Drummond. I was rewriting the protocol for what it meant to be a Coast Guard officer. I was proving that the institution did not have to be a rigid machine, but could be a living, breathing body capable of growth, provided someone was willing to steer it. I closed the logbook, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The unspoken mandate of my command was not just to operate the cutter, but to cultivate a crew that understood that their limitations were often just illusions, crafted by people who were afraid to test their own strength. The final voyage of my tenure as commanding officer of the Drummond was not marked by a ceremony or a speech, but by a transition this steady, inevitable handoff of the watch to the next generation of leadership. We had spent the year operating at the edge of our endurance, and the crew had grown into a unit that functioned with the fluidity of a single, well-oiled machine. As we prepared for the change of command, I found myself standing on the bridge one last time, looking out at the vast indigo expanse of the Pacific. The horizon was clear, a sharp line separating the sky from the sea, a boundary that felt entirely permeable now. I thought of the path that had led me here, the brow on that cold morning, the laughter of the lieutenant, the sharp, authoritative voice of Owen Vance, and the steady, quiet strength of the mother I had met in a small kitchen by the coast. Each of these moments had been a stone in the foundation of my life, a necessary weight that allowed me to stand upright. Owen Vance was retiring shortly after me, a fact that had brought a strange, heavy quiet to the bridge during our final watch together. He stood near the helm, his posture as impeccable as it had been the day we reunited. He didn't look at the sea with the same intensity anymore. He looked at it with the affection of a man who had finally made peace with an old, difficult friend. "You know, Captain," he said, breaking the silence, "when I pulled you out of the dark that night, I honestly didn't think you'd ever walk again, let alone lead a ship of this class." I smiled, turning to face him. "I didn't think so either, Owen. But the water is a patient teacher." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in the statement. We talked about the sailors we had served with, the ones who had made it and the ones who remained in the stories we told. And for the first time, the grief didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a tether, something that kept us grounded in the importance of the work we did. As the Drummond pulled into the pier for the final time under my command, the transition felt seamless. I had prepared the crew not just to follow orders, but to exercise the kind of judgment that I had been fighting for throughout my career. I looked down at the pier, seeing the faces of the new officers, the young sailors who had grown under my watch, and I knew that the culture I had built would persist long after I was gone. I wasn't leaving behind a hole in the organization. I was leaving behind a blueprint. I walked down the brow one last time, not with the trepidation of a stranger, but with the steady, measured pace of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. The ceremony was brief, the language of the service unfolding with a grace that felt entirely appropriate. When I turned the con over to my successor, I didn't feel the pang of loss I had anticipated. I felt the profound relief of a job finished to the best of my ability. I had returned to the deck. I had reclaimed my life, and I had left the vessel in the hands of people who understood that their worth was determined not by the ease of the path, but by the courage they displayed when the wind blew against them. As I walked away from the pier, the sound of the ocean at my back, I didn't look back at the cutter. I looked toward the horizon, where the future stretched out, unmapped and waiting. I had learned that the sea has no opinion of you, and that the world will try to force you into the boxes it has designed for you. But that power is not a position you are granted, it is a space you claim. I had walked through the dark. I had crossed the bar, and I had returned to the light. The watch was over, but the life I had chosen, the life of standing, of leading and of existing without apology, had only just begun. The transition to civilian life, or rather, the transition to a life without the structured embrace of a naval vessel, was a peculiar kind of adjustment that I had not fully anticipated. I had spent a decade defining myself by the arc of a brow, the integrity of a hull, and the discipline of a watch. And suddenly, the vast silence of my own autonomy felt like a different kind of storm. I found myself in a house I had purchased years ago but rarely occupied, a quiet space near the coast, where the rhythm of the tide provided the only reliable timekeeper. The grief I had shared with Rosa Sandoval had receded from the sharp, jagged edge of trauma into a steady, manageable current, but the absence of the uniform left a void that took time to map. I spent my days walking the shoreline, not with the goal of reaching a destination, but with the intent of reclaiming my relationship with the water, not as a commander, but as a person. I had become accustomed to the gaze of others, the way people would occasionally scan my gait, looking for the telltale hitch of the prosthetic. But in this quiet coastal town, I was just another face, and that was a freedom I had to learn to navigate. The local community knew me as the captain, a title that stuck even without the stripes. But they didn't know the weight of the Marielle or the cold precision of the nights I had spent on the bridge. One afternoon, I ran into Sawyer Ridgway, who had been stationed at a nearby facility, and we sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, the salt spray misting our faces. He was older, more seasoned, and he told me about the changes on the Drummond, how the crew still used the standards I had implemented as their benchmark for excellence. It was a profound realization to understand that leadership is not merely the exercise of authority while present, but the seeding of values that endure in your absence. I told him about the silence I had found in my own life, the way I had finally learned to reconcile the woman who had lost her leg with the woman who had gained a command. We spoke about the nature of survival, not the survival of the body, but the survival of the sense of self that the service often attempts to grind away. I had spent so much of my career terrified that if I didn't prove myself every single day, I would be discarded, but standing there with Sawyer, I realized that I had proven enough. I had carried the boy in my mind for 10 years, and then I had placed him down with the help of a mother's grace. I had faced the man who had mocked me and watched him crumble under the weight of his own hubris, not because I was vindictive, but because I was authentic. The shore offered a different kind of lesson, a lesson of stillness. I had been a woman of motion, of rushing against the tide, of forcing my way through obstacles. But here, the ocean taught me that there is power in waiting. The waves did not force their way into the sand. They arrived in their own time, with their own force, and they retreated when they were done. I had finally achieved a balance between the prosthetic and the limb, between the memory and the reality, and between the duty and the person. I was no longer a woman at war with her own history. I was a woman who had integrated her history into the architecture of her future. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the harbor, I realized that I had finally arrived at the destination I had been chasing since the night of the gale. I wasn't just a survivor, and I wasn't just a captain. I was simply fully and finally Sarah. The final chapter of my journey did not conclude with an ending, but with a beginning that felt entirely consistent with the person I had been forced to become. I found myself frequently invited to speak at training academies, to share the narrative of the Marielle and the importance of professional humility, but I always refused to frame it as a story of triumph. I framed it as a story of perspective. I would stand before rooms of young, eager cadets, their faces mirroring the ambition I once held, and I would tell them that the most dangerous thing they would ever do is assume they knew the value of a person based on the surface of their experience. I spoke of the captain who had mocked the brow, and I saw the recognition in their eyes not necessarily because they were cruel, but because they understood the temptation of the hierarchy, the ease with which one can slip into the role of the judge. I emphasized that the prosthetic was never the defining feature of my life, but rather the catalyst for my own awakening. I told them that if they ever found themselves in a position of power, their true test would not be in how they commanded their subordinates, but in how they treated the person who appeared to be the weakest. I became an advocate for the integration of wounded warriors into active duty, not because it was the humane thing to do, but because it was the most strategically sound decision for an institution that claimed to value resilience. I showed them that a body changed by trauma is not a body that has been broken. It is a body that has been rebuilt, often with a structural integrity that surpasses the original. My home became a space for veterans who were struggling with the same transition I had undergone, a place where the air was cleared of the suffocating need for performance. We talked about the leg, the socket, the morning rituals, and the deep, silent shame of being the one who lived when others did not. I watched them find their footing, literally and figuratively, and I saw the same transformation in them that I had experienced. It was the architecture of standing not just physically, but spiritually. It required the courage to look at your own loss, to accept its presence, and then to build your life around it rather than in spite of it. I realized that my years of silence had been a long, dark corridor that I had to walk alone. But the door at the end had always been unlocked. One evening, I returned to the pier where the Drummond was currently moored for repairs. I didn't go aboard. I simply stood at the edge of the water, looking at the white hull, the bright work reflecting the artificial lights of the port. A young seaman, one I didn't recognize, walked by and offered a polite, respectful nod. I realized then that my legacy on that ship was not the fear of my name, but the consistency of the culture I had fostered. I had set a standard, and it had held. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had walked onto that brow a decade ago, terrified and alone, and I had left it as a woman who knew that she belonged to the sea, to the service, and to herself. As I turned to leave the pier, the sound of the wind in the halyards felt like a melody I had finally learned to play. I didn't look back at the cutter. I looked toward the house on the coast, where the coffee was waiting and the future was wide, open, and entirely my own. The story of the Marielle was no longer a weight around my neck. It was a compass in my hand. I had taken the bar, I had paid the price, and I had returned to tell the tale. I was the architect of my own standing. And as I walked toward the shoreline, the leg beneath me felt not like metal or carbon, but like the foundation of everything I had yet to build. The watch was over, the storm had passed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the water, I was finally learning how to thrive upon it. What we've witnessed today isn't just a story about a career ruined or a ship handed over. It's a profound lesson on the anatomy of resilience. You see, the captain who mocked the brow wasn't just a villain in a uniform. He represented every person, every doubt, and every system that has ever looked at your scars and decided they were the end of your story. The greatest trap we fall into is believing that we have to prove our worth to those who have already decided we are beneath them. But look at the truth. Your value is not a borrowed commodity. It is not something you gain through permission. And it is certainly not saying that it's because someone else refuses to see it. When we face those who try to make us feel unsteady, we have a choice. We can either retreat or we can plant our feet, own the space we have earned, and let our actions do the talking. True power doesn't scream. True power is the quiet confidence of a person who has walked through the fire, carried the weight of the night, and decided that they aren't going anywhere. Whether you've lost a job, a dream, or a piece of yourself, remember this: the sea has no opinion of you. The world has no authority over your soul. You are the architect of your own return. If this story has sparked something in you, if it reminded you of a time you had to stand your ground, take that feeling and use it. Don't let someone else's narrow vision become your reality. Keep standing, keep leading, and keep proving that you are far more than the version of you that others try to build in their heads. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for being part of this journey. This content was researched, structured, and edited manually to bring you meaningful insights and lessons.